Hello everyone, today we talk about Milanese armor, a quite requested topic from my audience that of course is incredibly important for the understanding of Western medieval warfare, not just through the actual history of, say, essentially the Lombard. We can extend this to say Milan. Today we will look at Milan specifically as the most important center of arms and armor production as a city-state, and as you know later on it's sort of a regional power. Of course, there were other important centers such as Brescia. We will talk a lot about these cities, but we've made a series about Milan for the historical regional series and partly address the topic, mostly from an economical point of view. But in fact, there is a veritable aspect in business model and its connection with warfare that makes, in fact, the Milanese armor and, in fact, the Lombard, the Italian one, the most advanced, for sure, in Western civilization, as well as possibly in the world, considering the pinnacles, right, of technical skills and of actual production capacity that are nothing short of extraordinary, and that is, in fact, one of the few popularized topics aside from, say, the age of the condottieri, even though the Milanese tradition in armor making was predating that, as we will see now. A reason for which we will surely talk more about this in other videos. You know that in the historical units series we cover, in fact, certain prototypes based on, in fact, the for a period like mostly like late medieval Europe, pretty well outlined panoplies that in many cases, especially through the beautiful Italian art, iconography and archaeology, are very precisely reconstructable, and that we will see step by step. I think we never covered really it, but there are plenty of them. We will make at least, I think, tens of those military historical units episodes. There is also, in fact, a broader European dimension in this, because the Milanese primacy doesn't come out of the blue, right, in the history of the art of war, and in the importance, in fact, of the Italian military. This summer I made a series from the original warfare one that illustrated Italian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, where we also took a look at in fact, the very advanced military technology that the Italians were pioneering essentially beyond France. This was possibly even just by itself the single most technologically advanced country in Europe at the time, with the finest military technology as well. That in turn corresponds, in fact, to an era that is often overlooked, that mostly is the age of communal warfare. Then the so-called condottieri one kicks in, right? And you know that I insist very much. We didn't cover too much condottieri history. I'm going to make up for that, because I understand that I can introduce people to other parts, lesser known parts of medieval warfare through the more popularized topics. But the communal era is the real peak of medieval civilization for Italy and for Europe as a whole, especially the Italian Trecento, in which you find, in fact, also the rise of the condottieri later on. And it's all mixed with this pre-existing and shockingly advanced military culture and level of belligerence. In fact, it has been noticed by many scholars, basically does not find comparison in the rest of Europe. For not talking about the money that circulated here that also fueled war elsewhere. Just the other day we were talking about Edward I's, in fact, Italian connections because of the financial support in the wars against France. It was also subsidized by other Italian houses, etc. And there is also an early modern history that deserves a great recognition in the what appears to be, in fact, the sunset, right, of Italian dominance as a great power, in spite of the fact that it was not a united country, etc. But essentially, England, Holland surpass Italy in terms of richest per capita countries in the world. Only in the late 17th century, at that point, there had been the siege of Candia. Venice fundamentally ceases to be a superpower as we intended. But throughout all this period, in fact, in this 16th to 17th century, that you also don't hear much sort of Italian warfare from the so-called pop culture, including YouTube media. Milanese arms and armor production was still on the fore. It wasn't fundamentally surpassed, and it contributed, especially in terms of luxury products, as also armor, as you know, was becoming at that point for strictly military reasons that are obvious with the full affirmation of firearms, but still of the highest quality, and bringing also a lot of wealth during, for example, the Spanish domination of Milan, that, as you know, followed to the Italian wars. And so there is actually a very long history of arms and armor production, especially in the Lombard area hegemonized by Milan, that, as you know, was by far one of the most advanced, if possibly even the most advanced region in the world at the time. Now, from Spain to Poland and from England to the rest of the Mediterranean, the most renowned sovereigns and military leaders adorned themselves in armor crafted in Milan. Right, this was probably the hallmark of military of arms and armor quality, really. And this was not only the finest armor, but also the most exquisite, coveted, and expensive in the world. Right, and we're not talking just about the functionality, the practicality, but even just the mere aesthetics of that, the decorations. Here I inserted, we'll talk mostly about medieval history, but I inserted lots of pictures from especially early modern armor that was crafted for the greatest sovereigns at the time from Milan, purchased from there, even in times in which that sort of contact with other countries, because of the various alliances, etc., especially during the Italian wars, was not so obvious. All right, and we witnessed this in other ways, say about the Wars of the Roses, etc. Like the fact that Italian armor was essentially the most popular, the most sought after, and popular in the sense of say coveted, not in the sense it was cheap, but of course it was part of a broader range of arms and armor production, around which also the same Italian powers revolved for, of course, the equipment of their forces that at the time were really formidable. So this is essentially what you think normally of Milan still today. In the blue, in the southern extremity of the blue banana in Europe, is considered the richest, most industrialized part of the continent. Milan is hailed essentially as the world capital of fashion and design, mostly. It is celebrated for its unique ability to harmonize aesthetics with industrial production, propel technological advancement, and merge beauty with utility. So it's, the idea of the Italian style, something that people sort of became more familiar of, mostly from, say, the idea of mostly post-World War II Italy, but that mostly stems from a much older time, right? So in fact, while many regard the international acclaim of the Lombard capital as a recent triumph born out of this creative fervor spurred by economic prosperity, like after the boom of the 50s, of the 60s. In fact, a closer examination of its history reveals that Milan reached such heights many centuries ago, and that also in between that, regarding the ups and downs, it was never very far from that level of if anything, on the industrial capacity, considering the era, right? The so-called industrialized triangle, Milan, Turin, Genoa, was also, say, in the 19th century, pre-unitary Italy, one of the most developed areas in the continent. And so this in turn is, in fact, the legacy, the foundations of which are traditionally dating back much backwards in time, and in fact in the very Middle Ages, right? And the topic revolves around a particular kind of garment, sturdy and weighty, yet equally prestigious and luxurious, that has become to symbolize status for its wearers, right? Starting in the Middle Ages, Milan emerged as the undisputed leader in armor production. Essentially, there is all we'll see now, also in a chronological spectrum, how, say, Milanese arms and armor came to be the finest in the world. Also, in parallel to the local Milanese political history, but just a very quick sketch, because we talked about metallurgy and arms and armor making from antiquity or throughout. So, as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, it was one of the earliest connections between Rome and the Celtic world had brought to the development of Noricum as a very advanced metallurgical production, from which, in fact, the Romans also in imperial times extracted from the famous Calibus Noricum, actually the same mines, you can argue, say, in a broader geological and geographical sense, are exploited in Austria. Like, there are some significant, if you think about also Sweden during the 30 Years' War, that still, like, these countries are connected with that. Because in that case, the iron extracted had naturally a very good, precise proportion of carbon, when it's just a few points percentage, but that confers to iron, in fact, those characteristics that bring us to define it as steel. Today, that steel we would consider just like wrought iron. It's not even considered steel by contemporary engineering standards. Nevertheless, it was very important. There were other important metallurgical centers in Europe, for example, in Spain, notably. However, Noricum was arguably the most important. And during the migration era, however, the broader center decade, shifting the one of arms and armor production in the upper middle Rhine Valley. Right, this mostly happens under the Frankish edges that corresponded to the Merovingian powers, the greatest one in Western Europe, and continued, in fact, up until the 11th, the 12th century, when Lombardy emerged as the most advanced center instead, right? This is crucial because still the Rhineland, also like its proximity with countries like the Ile-de-France as a broader region, Flanders, neighboring Flanders, etc., also England to an extent, were very much like the core of Western wealth. The blue banana we were talking about before, in many ways, does continue, you see, from the Middle Ages till today, which was also very much the cradle of chivalry, of knighthood. And even though, as we will see better now, Milan, that was the largest city in the West together with Paris, was a communal regime, right, that developed like from the late 11th to the beginning of the 12th century, and that brought the city to withstand the same imperial onslaught of Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II. So with an immense military power, but also an importantly different mindset that is connected with a third estate, or in that case, command, even though, of course, these Italian communes were run de facto by knights themselves, except in Italy it was a matter of census. They weren't really the originally feudal elements, and yet these were the same that managed, especially in Lombardy, to keep, other, take foreign powers out and or cooperating with them, but maintaining a significant autonomy within the Holy Roman Empire. So you can understand why Milanese arms and armor were also reflecting that same political, military, and social development. The Milanese dominance endured for centuries, despite fierce competition, only waning by the end of the Renaissance itself, as we were saying before, mostly to advancements in firearm technology that diminished the military significance of armor and led to a sharp decline in demand. Right? Milan was also famous for glassware. It had, again, still a prosperous role in the broader Habsburgic world, just like other cities, for example, like Genoa, were very famed for banking. Also, the Milanese were, for that matter. Many of the so-called Lyonnese bankers were actually saying Italians in connection with the French as well. So there was a great vibrancy and vivacity in this business and general industrial activities for the time standards exactly in this region. From the workshops of Milan came not only exquisite masterpieces destined for royalty and the elite families of Europe, but also mass-produced armaments for the same Milanese armies that by the 1300s were counting 30,000 men, which is not an exaggeration. There is an incredible level of misinformation in pop culture and also in the main military history channels on YouTube regarding the actual size of medieval armies and the actual evidence that we have to confirm how large they actually were, especially in these areas. I will not digress on this, but just for saying, like, if you look at the war game series by Jan Hit, etc., these people literally had never opened a book about Italian history that wasn't written for some reason by an Anglo-Saxons like Mallet or whatever, and just gave a incredibly poor and amatorial, fragmentary information about the actually enormous amount of Italian documentation of the period that was also like pretty much public ever since the 19th century, and very, say, if not widely studied, unfortunately, because part of the reason that the Italians themselves didn't study much these topics, but they were very accessible from the same sources that would be consulted for other types of research. It wasn't a military one. And of course, today there is sort of a revival in interest in the topic from many areas in the world. It's not just about Europeans. It's like a broader Western interest, but still the sense that essentially the most advanced militaries of the time were, like in northern central Italy, is still pretty much properly absent from the cultural horizons of the average person. This is incredibly insane, considered like all the hype about medievalism and warfare and knights and battles and whatever, and then you like the very ABC of this. Villani reports quite also clearly that even in the decline of the Communal army, that would be like those 30,000 men that Milan, through also the same Lombard League, that basically had become a projection of its city-state power, could maintain from 5,000 to 6,000 barbuta, which means literally men at arms. Half a century later, not even, which the Florentine chronicler observed was essentially the same size of the French king's armies in Europe. They were the largest in Europe. This is true also later. The same Philippe de Comines is quite clear about the fact that the same band d'ordonnance that would become sort of the first so-called permanent nucleus of the French army in that case were directly inspired to the armies of the Italian Signory that already had that same scale of force, like properly from a numerical point of view, but also in the quality of it. I made a video about the Venetian army. If you want to have some sort of broader, at least Italian indicator, we have never talked about the Milanese army per se, right? But they were similar. In essence, I included even here in the pictures the statues of Colleoni, of Gattamelata, so condottieri that at times were fighting also in different powers. But in fact, this is also important to understand in the measure in which Milanese armor is a synecdoche for a broader Lombard and actually Italian types of arms and armor making. There is no doubt, equally, however, that Milan was the most advanced center of all within the same Italy, simply because Milan was essentially the most state of the Italian states. Right, it was the greatest power at the end of the Middle Ages, and it had achieved a level of uniformity in its administration and territorial control unknown in the rest, especially the central northern Italian states, which included, in fact, the same arms and armor production, supplies, logistic lines, etc. So this is incredibly important to understand where these masterpieces of arms and armor came from, showcasing an industrial infrastructure capable of catering to a diverse and intricate market. During the Middle Ages, the demand for weaponry was so pronounced that every significant settlement boasted at least one blacksmith. In contrast, artisans specializing in armor, known as armorari, were fewer in number, as their craft was considerably more intricate and costly than that of sword making and other weapon production. If you're interested, I made a video about the coat of mail already, and again, you can visit my playlists of different, say, topics to find actually lots of videos that revolve around this topic. A little step back in time, as we've seen in the series about Milan. Since Roman times, this city has been a city far more significant than most people still today, and inexplicably realized from 286 to 402, Emperor Diocletian designated it as the capital of the Western Roman Empire, de facto due to its strategic location and economic and social importance. As a result, it attracted the ambitions of various barbarian invaders, including the Visigoths, the Huns, the Goths, the Longobards, and the Franks, all of whom sought to claim it as the ultimate prize. Milan is very well located, like you have France on one side, Germany from the other, you have the broader connections, north, south, from Central to Europe to the Italian peninsula, you have a broader also eastern direction connecting it to other powerful as strategic Italian cities. You know that by the time of the Tetrarchy, the true, say, centers of Roman power were so mostly because of their military character. In fact, Milan went together with Trier, Nicomedia, and Antioch. The city would remain not just one of the largest in the West, and actually the largest together again with Paris in the High Middle Ages, but up to that point it had been a quite important center during the Gothic, Lombard, and Frankish rule as one of the most important recipients of Romano-Germanic culture, identity, and power right at the time. Like the sense of municipal pride stemmed directly from that sense of civitas that the Italian cities in particular maintain straight throughout all the early Middle Ages, uninterrupted from Roman times. This was particularly the case for Milan, right? This was sort of the kind of Roman alter ego within the Lombard kingdom compared to Pavia, and that was sort of more Germanic, militarized, but the same Lombard kings used Milan as a residence, and they attended local chariot races in the spectacles in the local circus. So you really have that sense of might and prosperity from quite early on. It was not until Charlemagne that Milan, however, was brought on the fore really as an imperial county and connected to a veritable European-wide dimension, right? The conquest of Charlemagne, as you know, put together a pretty substantial amount of it. What had been, in fact, the major Western nations already at that point with a single administrative, institutional, and properly imperial framework. We are in 822, a time during which Milan entered a period of lasting peace, at least as far as the previous conquests were concerned. Now the situation stabilized. As you know, the kingdom of Italy was the one to which the same Charlemagne attached the imperial crown, that also as a kingdom was equated to the Frankish one, unlike any other country conquered by the Franks. And this allowed, regardless of course of all the clashes, the conflicts and violence that erupted periodically, also to mold and to strengthen further the fabric of Western Europe, to flourish to an unprecedented degree. Milan has a rich history of iron working, with documents dating back to the 10th century, incredibly underrated moment for the re-expansion and the literal booming of Western civilization, affirming this legacy in both the Lombard city and its surrounding areas. The earliest evidence of weapon production in the Lombard capital dates to 1066, so that while William the Conqueror was landing in England, I recently made a video for the anniversary of the battle, Milan was already flourishing with what is still today Via Spadari, so essentially the sword maker's street, existing in its historical center, just a short distance from where the Duomo, the cathedral, would be built over 2 centuries later during the Gothic age. This street, along with Via degli Armorari, which means the armorer's street, now home to a well-known market for numismatic collectors. I have some numismatic gifts from my audience. As you know, I have created a little series, but this is another story. Formed the core around which Milan's renowned blacksmiths thrived. Right, it was a veritable quarter connected with armor production, but this at least was concentrated, bearing the name of the same crafts still today in the urban toponymy. Throughout these tumultuous times, of course, the city endured largely to the resilience of its inhabitants, who fostered a strong desire for autonomy, a hallmark especially of the Lombard cities that would be expressed also by other centers that had especially belonged to the kingdom, and ultimately found the strength to achieve it. This commendable goal was realized, as you know, with the signing of the Peace of Constance on June the 25th, 1183, which brought an end to the wars against Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had been defeated at the Battle of Legnano. One of my earliest videos on Schwerpunkt from the cycle was about this battle, but we have to remake it because the video is too old, let's say. And it's not poorly made in terms of historical accuracy. It's just, I spoke at the time much worse English than I do today. In any case, that's definitely a period that we have had the opportunity of browsing. We will come back on, but there that Milan had literally been raised by the emperor and essentially rebuilt itself from scratch and resisted once again. It withstood, especially in its infantry component that had, quite a strong connection with this arms and armor making ability as artisans, as craftsmen. The same imperial cavalry in open field, which was something that boosted also the morale of all those estates in Europe that were looking at this and saying, so we can face actually heavy cavalry in open field and think to at least to get away with that. By the 13th century, Milan boasted a population of around 200,000 people. making it one of the few cities of its size in Europe. It continued to expand until it was established as a duchy. This happened a bit later. We're in 1395 under Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the pinnacle of significance in both Italy and Europe of Milanese power. But the actual peak, like in terms of of absolute growth, was in fact during the one of the same great medieval civilization, and it is let's say photographed, so to say, by the famous work De Magnalibus Urbis Mediolani by the monk Bonvesin de la Riva, who was a Milanese. We are in 1288, when the population of Milan reached that 200,000. This is a source, in fact, illustrating that might, right? That sense of municipal pride, of immense, and de facto state-like power, because this is really the intrinsic characteristic and you can say exception of the Italian communes in the rest of history. Like that, these were not towns run by sort of guilds, third estate. These were actual states, both by, as we've seen, like political compaction, statehood, but also territorial extent and military power. Again, they had, Milan alone had, dominating at this point over Lombardy, had, again, the same military capability of a major Western European kingdom like France. And so this is no exaggeration. This is actually notorious to anyone who has studied the period, except, I stress it again, nobody for some reason seems to get the memo of this or talk about it. We still get the Emtint battle, the Hussite wars, or the Wars of the Roses, but nobody covers this topic. This monk living in Milan said that the city was home to, quote, more than 100 manufacturers of armor, each employing numerous workers engaged in the marvelous art of the macchie, which in Italian means stains, and that in this case refer to the decorated parts of armor, right? So engraving in particular decorations. Now, for perspective, consider that Bonvesin notes that there were 440 butchers in Milan alone, indicating essentially, if you make the proportion, that merchants of this commonly consumed good outnumbered armor producers by only a factor of 4, right? So imagine, wherever you live, that for every 4 butcher shops, you have actually one armory, one place where you can go buy guns. Let's put it in this way, right? And this is way more than any other sort of certain statistical concrete evidence, like just the measure. This is also the power, in fact, of narrative sources that match, of course, also with the overwhelming evidence that we have from all the other indicators of the radical level of militarization in communal Italy. The fact that, of course, the city was very prosperous. As we've seen, this was one that I made a video just recently about really wealth and gibbeling armies of the second half of the 13th century that really, after especially the death of Frederick II, had literally boomed, because between, say, after the two wars of the Lombard League, you have the Italians say liberating all these massive resources employed to defend themselves from this essentially imperial attempt of subjugation of the region, and at least some sort of cooptation that should have representated some more rigid feudal hierarchy. All the same sources in fighting one another, and this is in fact the moment in which the city-states begin truly to take over one another and build regional states, which is in a sense what also the Holy Roman Emperors had tried to prevent, to stop, like at least, that Barbarossa, aside from the issues that were happening in Rome with the Pope that had been overthrown by some heretics, descended into Italy from Swabia, that is just bordering Lombardy, of course, for taming Milanese expansion against the city of Lodi, that later would actually sign against the same Barbarossa when it was cleared now with the general trend of, in some cases, German occupation. It wasn't really like an Italian versus German thing, but to a degree. Like, of course, it did work like that as well. Eventually fought alongside the same Milan. Again, we'll talk about this in other videos. You don't have to worry about not going. We are pretty thorough with every single European region. But it gives you an idea of the wealth, really, that these cities and their militias really had. I remember also one of the earliest videos about the same passage by Bonvesin de la Riva about Milan, explaining, among the other things, how really materially wealthy these communes really were. And it didn't stop there, because, of course, without moral forces, not even the material ones work. Right? This is arguably the peak if you study, say, Milanese expedition towards the end of the 13th century, the issues that the commune sent to also to both to the city and the county, let's say, and the ones of the subjected / allied cities. Like Milan was to attend alone the provision of 30,000 soldiers. Right, at this point, we're properly like citizens and peasants, right, and that had to be equipped with some of the most updated weapons, also of specialized type, like bludgeoning weapons, pikes, crossbows, and with pretty good sound armor that we'll again see better in detail in some other video. So a veritable military machine that is paralleled by, in fact, this equally impressive arms and armor production. Bonvesin de la Riva's testimony is thus particularly valuable for assessing the production capacity and technological advancements achieved by local artisans in this industrial sector. Just from his description, we can get how in Milan, not only, but with actually a peak achieved here, armor was crafted from tempered and polished steel that shone like mirrors and was sold by merchants in vast quantities to both nearby and distant cities. Right? You could literally look at yourself in the armor like a mirror, which is also the reason why it was called white armor. Milanese manufacturers distributed their armor across Europe and beyond, meeting local demand while also catering to clients in neighboring Venice and Genoa, who subsequently exported these goods as far as the Levant. Right? This is an element of major commercial importance in the later Middle Ages. I made multiple videos about not just the Italian financial hegemony at this time, but also like the resilience of post 14th century crisis Italian banking giants. And when Milan does not have an access to the sea, it has the capacity of subjugating Genoa every once in a while. But the Italian city-states have a shocking homogeneity at every political, military, and social level. They all have essentially the same institutional development. They are all interconnected, economically, commercially speaking. Imagine originally having these 30 city-states that are warring against one another as virtually independent powers that, however, contrary to this trope that we have about that connected at least with political fragmentation, are all strikingly alike. Right, the fact that they're politically divided doesn't mean that they were different from one another. There's a great stereotype that still lives in the in even considering, like, for example, the contemporary country that is actually not more heterogeneous than basically any other major country in Europe, but that only had a different narrative in the way things were said, even within the same country, but mostly abroad that does not consider that already at this time, especially central and northern Italy, had a markedly, as strikingly compact, homogeneous, and common background, right? And also for this reason, they were so efficient as far as their the internal context, the ones with abroad also were concerned, right? Milanese armor found its way to the major feudal powers of the time. Think about Savoy, France, England, the Papal territories, and southern Germany, right? This is really like, if you look at the heart of what the West actually is, this is basically it, even just from an economical point of view. We should reevaluate the overwhelming compactness and hardcoreness of Western civilization through these indicators, right? Savoy, France, England, these are properly the champions of European chivalry in many ways. The Papal territories are incredibly militarized and feudal in nature. Actually, the most famous condottieri came from central Italy, from Rome, from Umbria, from the Romagnol area is actually northern Italian, but still part of the Papal States. In this era, had these been more compact, had it been a Papal state rather than Papal states, probably this would have, instead of Milan, almost hegemonized like the entire peninsula. The same southern Germany. Southern Germany, that was, of course, the richest, the more developed in the nation, except for parts of the Rhineland, but that definitely saw the development, as you know, of great principalities in later medieval times. And unsurprisingly, the only veritable competitors to the Italian armors, even though they wouldn't surpass them, because as we'll see that their background, their business model was different, like their politics, their society was different. But these are incredibly intertwined eras. And Italian armies and armor attracted powerful lords, princes, kings, eager to acquire these precious artifacts forged in Lombardy. Today we do not talk about the same chivalric, knightly culture that the Italian signories actually own. Never make the mistake of considering the Italian states as, these were mercantile republics. It's, yes, in institutional terms, you can say that they were, of course, they had essentially the more egalitarian regimes in Europe at the time. Inexplicably, I made a video about this also. They were called tyrants by some later foreign historiography, but those historiographies, countries at the time were actually ruled by kings, so nobody really understand what they're tyrannic about. But if you look at Milan, at least you understand this was truly the most, say, tyrannical of all, at least the central, say, in a sense, in a monarchic, autocratic sense of the central northern Italian countries. Then you had the Neapolitan kingdom that was in fact a veritable feudal country, like in all. But also from a military point of view, realize that these were primarily actual states, right? Even in a extensively territorial sense, and that even though we have this idea of the communes, of the republican bias, that of course they were lorded over by their own citizens, as they had always been. That, especially like in Lombardy, were considered like the great lords of Lombardy, great people that really lived at the top of the most, in fact, chivalric, knightly standards in ways that were also mirrored by this Italian influence in other courts. And that had hella shock, ultra-heavy cavalry in the finest numbers and finest standards of the time, Italian or foreign alike, that needed, as we were saying before, the numbers of the Milanese army, overwhelmingly large amounts of arms and armor. And these really were the better ones available at the time. So artifacts forged in Lombardy were the top-notch ones that every great ruler in Europe would want to have because of their quality. A notable example is the extensive supply of armor prepared by Federico il Lombardo, which means Frederick the Lombard, a Milanese merchant and blacksmith, in 1295, for nonetheless than the French King Philip IV, Philip the Fair. This order, by the way, comprised 5,067 plate armors, 4,511 chainmail hauberks, 1,374 gorgets, that are neck defenses, 2,853 helmets, 751 pairs of gloves, mittens, armored gloves, and over 6,000 shields. This is the equivalent of an entire French Royal Army arms and armor there, right? Commissioned to a single and evidently very powerful, of course, Milanese merchant and blacksmith. We're in 1295. This is a period, like in a few years, Philip IV would obtain from Musciato Francese, who was a contractor, also the Lord of Piacenza, Alberto Scotti, thousands of Italian pikemen and crossbowmen to fight against the same Flemish infantry, and even actually scoring success. This after the Battle of Courtrai. So we're talking again about that very peak of medieval European warfare standards that for some reason were completely ignored by historiography. People just hear, say, of the generation of Legnano and the early fights, let's say, of the communes, and then just skipping to the condottieri in the mid-14th century. Literally, the in-between part is one of the single most shockingly advanced military cultures in the history of mankind. Nobody talks about that. This is absolutely shocking. I denounced this also in a recent interview, and it's utterly insane. It's just as if you crossed out essentially 1/5 of say what actually matters in medieval warfare, for reasons that, of course, I could stop explaining for hours, but that we don't have time for today. And commissions like that, there are so many, of course, indicators for it, but just this example alone tells you what a single Milanese merchant could do. That is resupplying essentially an entire French royal army. Then you have also much more famous names, especially circulating. This I know because I'm not part of that, but say certain reenactors or HEMA circles. I think everybody knows Francesco Dattini, the merchant of Prato, which is a Tuscan commune close to Florence, that is often regarded also as some sort of founder of Italian, you couldn't say capitalism, but at least, he is such, at least we have the luck of having preserved his Mercatura documents, so an endless pool of also, we are in the same time, by the way, of the peak of the broad commerce and trade, and these were men that lived great part of their lives abroad, controlled assets all across Europe. So this is the best product of the European commercial civilization. And Dattini is important because he was also engaged among the various goods in the trade involving Milanese weaponry, primarily for mercenaries at that time. We are slightly later, but say after a couple of generations, in 1367, Dattini's warehouse in Avignon, that at that point was, as you know, the papal seat between the Holy Roman Empire and the French Kingdom, contained a remarkable inventory that included 38 helmets of various types, 80 reinforced breastplates composed of plates, likely brigandines, that is flexible armor, as you know, designed to protect the torso, 23 pairs of iron plate gloves, and 12 iron chainmail shirts, right? And this is just, of course, it's much less grandiose than the other example, but it's because also with the 14th century crisis, there has been a dramatic shrinking of in production, but not in long-range trade. Actually, the elites were even more active in that sense. And this unit, of course, like were weapons you could, as armor mostly, that would resupply a sizable force of professional troops, say a small mercenary company of the many that roamed Europe exactly in those years. Most of the aforementioned stock had been imported directly from Milan or acquired from a Milanese armorer working in Avignon. As we've seen in the aforementioned video about chainmail, beginning in the 13th century, this iron armor, which had always been somewhat ineffective against blunt and piercing weaponry, began to be replaced by the resilient plate armor. It happened in very interesting ways, considering the early spread, especially from the Mongol frontier of Germany at the beginning of the 13th century, spread homogeneously across Europe. When you look at this is important to stress that Milan was the top notch, but mostly as a business model, because if you look at Western Europe, basically you can see also from the previous centuries that arms and armor were evolving all basically in the same way at the same time, which is beautiful because it tells you how intertwined Europe really was, so that regardless of the allegedly scarce, by the way, communication means or whatever, like the needs, like the basis for the most armed and armored elements like knights, men at arms of European armies were evolving in the same way. Didn't need to be that say even connected by the same power to evolve in parallel. So the normal explanation is the increasing prevalence and power of crossbows, rendering ringed mail obsolete, prompting producers to seek more effective forms of defense. I've always been skeptical with that notion because we have been hyper-fixated with the fact that crossbows and longbows changed everything. They didn't change much, telling the truth. They actually were just a byproduct of the boom of Western civilization, and there is no reason why you wouldn't want just a heavier armor if you can afford it, because, say, a knightly lance in your face is not something you would want to seek less protection from than a crossbow bolt, right? So you cannot dualistically, gnostically separate the two things. It doesn't make any sense. In any case, this solution over time laid in plate armor. But its production shaping presented significant challenges, of course, like they had yet to be pioneered in the ways, at least, that was needed in, later medieval times. Metal armor has always existed in every historical era, just it wasn't prevalent, right? Just helmets are normally made of plate. I say metal, so it meant plate armor. For a long time, medieval metallurgy could only work with small metal plates, though. Early smelting furnaces produced only limited amounts of workable metal, and the process of hammering, which predominantly served to remove slag from the glowing metal, and forging in metal waste of over a half, but sometimes even reaching 70% of the ferrous material. Consequently, the initial components of plate armor were limited in size and could only protect, at this point, at least the limbs, or at least they came out in bands. That this early armor actually started developing for the abdomen, but there were this little plates fixed one next to the other over an organic band of some sort. Now, the aforementioned account by Bonvesin de la Riva clearly demonstrates that the Milanese armor industry was very technologically sophisticated for its time, producing various plate pieces during an era still primarily dominated by chainmail armor. It would take a while before, another couple of generations at least, for plate armor to become prevalent over chainmail, because mostly it was a mixed solution. However, in this field, Milan would maintain a dominance that it would definitely maintain for a long time. The production of large metal plates adequate for protecting a warrior's torso necessitated a significant technological advancement. This required larger furnaces capable of generating higher temperatures and melting greater quantities of ore, since creating a breastplate weighing, say, 4 to 5 kilos demanded something like 10 to 15 kilos of iron, accounting for waste as well as machinery for hammering. Indeed, as the size of the plate increased, the precision of its hammering became even more critical. The risk of entrapment of slag within the metal heightened the chances of cracks forming during processing or creating weaknesses in the final product. It wasn't until the early 15th century that these challenges were effectively addressed, thanks to advancements in metallurgy that allowed for essentially insufflated furnaces capable of melting larger quantities of ore and producing steel ingot, right? That's the main problem. You have to maintain the furnace insufflated enough in a steady way for oxygen to allow it to burn like at always the same temperature within the furnace. That's why, for example, I don't know, the Indian wood steel was so much of a thing. They had monsoons, right? They literally operated furnaces with this winds that went the same direction, the same speed for 6 months in a row. So you could naturally insufflate the air into the furnace and maintaining that standard. Naturally, there were lots of sort of, also unfortunately, lost techniques that we can sort of just hypothesize about. We'll talk more about metallurgy. This is actually a much more, not just technical, but complicated topic. The 15th century definitely sees a great leap forward in Europe, and say not only, like at least Europeans made at large, actually larger use of armor than other countries, even others that had been sort of more, let's say, more technologically advanced, at least in that specific type of production, and apparently so, right? Because the comparison is somehow difficult. Like, how many, damascate sort of weapons can you produce, and where and how? What does that mean, and what was the general distribution of this among the various arms and armor? Because for one masterpiece, you would have, I don't know, other 10 pieces that weren't really that much. Some deteriorate, and people may want to use them anyway. So we have just a scarce understanding. But when you look at it's like with firearms, say that the Europeans did not apparently come up with it. It's debatable, by the way, but they are the ones who started making the more impacting, explosive use of that, right? It's a myth that the Chinese use it just for peaceful reasons, but they had a greater incendiary bias than an explosive one, for example. More sulfur, less saltpeter. Europeans fought a freaking lot of wars, right? They were tougher, they had this greater impact in this military advancements already at the time. Definitely the Milanese armor is a good reflection of that overall, as the rest, by the way, of European armor. Additionally, at this point, the widespread adoption and refinement of waterfall mills played a significant role. And Milan was pretty advanced in this kind of infrastructure as well. This type of mills utilized wheels driven by falling water, generating power equivalent to 60 horsepower, right, up to 20 times more potent than mills where the wheel was merely turned by the flow of a canal of river. And the strength of these new mechanisms enabled operators to introduce air into furnaces. That's how it happened. Power large automatic hammers and drive grinding wheels for polishing armor. Now, why is this important for the Milanese armor? Because, well, Lombardy has rivers in abundance, right? In Milan, the moats built by Barbarossa for defense had transformed into an intricate network of canals, including the Navigli. that actually still exist. Like in part, of course, they were eventually with modern times were further canalized and so on. Many were dried up, but so you can't say that Milan was like Venice on the canals, but it was conceptually like the city was well defended and served by waterways that facilitated, crucially, the transport of raw materials and semi-finished goods from the northern, these alpine valleys of Valsassina, the Brembana and Camonica valleys, and so this was a major trade network. The Milanese had essentially conquered all the communes in the Prealpine area, and they extended the control of important passes with Swabia, as we were pointing out before, with now the emerging Swiss power against which they would notoriously fight. Always remember that if the Swiss introduced the pike prevalence, right, and creating veritable pike squares and initiating Renaissance warfare, you have to partially tank the Milanese knights that are better dismounted from their horses, engage the Swiss halberdiers with their own knightly lances, and actually beat them. And that's where when the Swiss gather in their, in the away from indiscreet eyes in their mountain valleys, to determine that they had to reform their army. That's how they came up with it. That's also how, of course, precious the resources were to be fought over. Always, according to Bonvesin de la Riva, the canals of Milan powered over 900 mills. The canals of Milan alone, right? And then, of course, the countryside would have even more than that, like depending on how far you want to extend, in fact, the Milanese control. This infrastructure underscores Milan's leadership in armor production. Right, in mid-15th century, it was here that the first complete suits of armor in Europe emerged. Right, full plate armor was born in a broader conceptual term of approximation in Milan. Right, you have this large contoured plates that protected both the torso and the back of the wearer. And in fact, these were actually over Gothic armor the most favored, the most widespread, even as far as places like England. Like we have the idea that, again, it was more northern style, more or less aligning to the Gothic one. Especially like in Western Europe, this wasn't quite the case. Like Italian armor, even when you had to import, like it was the case of England, that especially by the mid-15th century, after the 100 Years' War, was a bit cut off from important opportunities and centers of production, etc. They had to import stuff from Flanders, like guns, horses as well. Well, the favorite armor was Italian. They would import the German one, because we'll see now it was pretty important as well. But the actual, if you study the actual orders, the actual description, like archaeological find, you will see that it's mostly Milanese stuff. Now, just to give a bit of chronological compass here, we are under Gian Galeazzo's rule by 1402. The city has gained control over almost the entire Po Valley, right, as well as Genoa, Siena, Perugia. The Milanese essentially reached the peak of their control. In many ways, it was at least on the fringes, relatively frail. The bulk of Milanese power was Lombardy, right, in other parts of the Po Valley, but they managed to infiltrate central Italy, the Apennines. They found sympathizers against other powers like Florence, right, or the Saint Papal States. In fact, these other centers. When there is some dynastic crisis in Milan, of course, the area of control shrinks again. But there is, at this point in history, the chance of Milan to truly create a unitary, at least central northern Italian power, right? To break the containment measures that especially Venice and Florence were putting against it. At this time, so we're in the 15th century, Milan's armor industry was not only leading in technological innovation, but it also demonstrated an impressive ability to meet large-scale supply demands. This is still true. We saw it already in the late 13th century. We see it in this age in which also the importance of armor has considerably increased. Right, the 15th century is the single most armored century in military history, at least for the soldiers, of course. And this meant that also because of the level of professionalism and the all the skills, the technicalities that using certain arms and armor entailed reflect in the sophistication of the business model as well. You want to satisfy your customers. Now, records show that the workshops could fulfill orders numbering in the hundreds and sometimes thousands of armor suits with apparent ease. Of course, they would have some stocks, but there is a notable example in 1420 when Armas completed an order for 4,000 full suits for knights and 2,000 for foot soldiers within a matter of days. Right? This is incredible. You understand from how different this is from the order of Philip IV of France, a bit more than a century before. There's been a great shrinking in the actual size of armies, and just now are beginning to fully recover, but mostly they're professional armies. And there is also an increased bias in actual cavalry forces. Right? Between the mid-14th and mid-15th century, cavalry actually regains ground over infantry. People forget this aspect all the time. And this order, of course, is excellent because regardless of course, like who would have used this armor, of course, whoever purchased it was an important power that had some stocks on its own, but you see the prevalence of 4,000 full plate armor for men-at-arms and only 2,000 for infantry forces. It's, by the way, an immense cost, especially for the time. It also reflects the importance of armoredness for horsemen. At some point, also horses, because this is the time which you get again more armor for horses as well. In history. So this remarkable, though not isolated instance, also depending on the luck in archive fishing, let's say, research, say better, instance highlights both the industrial efficiency of Milan and the city's economic capacity to manage significant inventory levels. Right, Milan had become a city fortress in many ways as well. Think about this Forza castle would be built later. You have all the Navigli, but it's important to stress how of course Milan would become this massive magazine, right, of arms and armor as well, other than just also the place where it was produced and sold from. It's important to stress how these Italian regional states by now that had in fact been built from the basis of one city succeeding in conquering others, and Milan was definitely the most successful of all in this, were revolving around this mother city. It was truly the cornerstone, together with the other ones, of any political and territorial domination. All right, so they're very, very strong, homogeneous, again, compact territory that developed from this. Milan, protected by the Alps, at the center of this imposingly prosper region of Europe, like, had gradually like consolidated the fabric existing between the various city-states that she had gradually subjugated. And the armor production was not, as we've seen, like just a yet another business like the others. The success of Milanese armors in catering diverse demands stems from such excellent organizational practices, also across all these centers. Many businesses adopted a vertical structure, a bit like the same Milanese seigneury, that encompassed the entire production of and sales process from ore extraction to the sale of the final product. And unlike their primary competitors in southern Germany, the Milanese were not restricted by guilds and corporations that impose rigid protective regulations. Instead, they embraced every available tool to remain adaptable to market needs. This is what I was saying before, because if you say just mercantile republic, you just basically humiliate the political and military might of the Italian states of the time. It's rather these, I don't know, what we see in Flanders or in Germany, the communes are largely confined, like in terms of political and territorial control, to their own city gates, outside of which the count and the bishop rule, because that's an overwhelmingly feudal country, and also within the same communes, there's basically just a third estate that rules from these guilds that do not evolve into some more unitary statal profile. You understand by scale how different Italy is in this, because in many ways, like there were some so-called popular governments, like the Florentine one. It was a bit like the antithesis of Milan because of that definitely greater republican streak, even though they had by this point a seigneury, like de facto like a monarchy embracing the entire city with the Medici. But Milan had, even in the case of Florence for that matter, like even if that the guilds themselves had established that kind of government, or just this had stabilized, but the guilds were also huge, right? They were, in the case of Florence specifically, like controlling the largest, the very richest city in the entire globe, right? From a strictly financial point of view. Not even Milan had been that, right? That was really more territorially oriented. In fact, Florence is not even this explosion of military power, even though they could feel definitely 30,000 men as the Milanese, yet other overlooked aspects about Florence as well, and even more sometimes on different fronts. But they didn't have that sort of more militaristic seigneurial bias like Milan had, right? In Milan, you really have a lord that has a monarchic, autocratic capacity. They marry actually to other royalty, like the French one, notably. That is also part of the reason why the French would later claim during the Italian wars, not just, of course, the Angevin legacy in southern Italy, but the same Milanese throne, you could say. This is technically a feudal power within the Holy Roman Empire, as we've seen with the Duchy. It was already before, like even the Communal, of course, was part of that broader hierarchy of powers. But there is a central administration. There is a state. There are a massive army that can control an entire region. This is a real state on its own. So you understand that even the difference in arms and armor production between, say, again, the Milanese and the Gothic, so-called Gothic one, in southern Germany, is of the same measure that you can appreciate in this. I also made a video that is loosely related, that is comparing the Mediterranean, and so virtually Italian trade, and the Baltic, and so virtually German one, or just prevalently Italian and German respectively. During the second half of the 14th century, and you can get the disproportion by tens of times. Naturally, again, this is also different because southern Germany, again, was richer than northern Germany. And in fact, also the Hanseatic League was mirroring compared, say, to the Italian maritime republics like Venice that had the largest navy around and could control, in fact, large swaths of Mediterranean. These were just a cluster of towns. They were also often conflicting with one another. They were also under, somebody else's rule to an extent. And so we must get the scale of the difference here. There is no doubt that also in the future, of course, the Northern Europe would rise to, as we were saying before, to surpass the South. But it's a very long-term process, and especially at this point, there is a disproportionality that in fact would never be reached even by Northern superiority up to this day. On the contrary, like as we were saying before, if you pick, say, central northern Italy by per capita wealth, that's richer than Sweden still, and at least the French and the German average, right? So this is actually the Italian per capita wealth alone, even including southern Italy in the account, is higher than, so in terms of actual wealth stored in banks, etc. It is higher than Germany and Sweden, which gives you an idea of how much, in spite of the fact that Italy lacked a unitary history up to 150 years ago, it still enjoys the fruits of not even the Renaissance, actually, but the actual Middle Ages at most, right? And so this is something you may want to keep in mind. Also, when for those things I say usually about the fact that there wasn't such a thing like a modern era, that we passed from essentially a medieval world to a contemporary one, the mid-14th century crisis was massive, right? The only difference with, say, the one of late antiquity is that, at least in the way we understand it, late antiquity sort of died, even though that's also sometimes sort of dark age kind of biased perspective from, say if you look at England, of course, we know much less. It was really a dark age, at least in terms of documentation, but it's in Mediterranean, also a great part of what we see here in the Middle Ages is the direct continuity of ancient times. It wasn't that catastrophic fall that destructured everything that should make you see, say, a phenomenon like the Italian communes, such a strange origin or anything. It was just like the product of the heavy, massive urbanization of the peninsula. Its enormous wealth, its early literacy and civilization, and that had led, in fact, to the same Western, through itself, the same Western one, and through the papacy, and through, again, it's mostly the way you've been habituated to think it otherwise because of the Black Legion or the anti-papistic stances. When you actually look at the fundamentals and the absolute sort of objective reality in history, you realize that quantitatively speaking and qualitatively as well, like in this case, for example, largely we have been prevented from appreciating that scale, right? And this is actually what I try to do on Schwerpunkt, because I feel like nobody is talking about it, that most of disclosure content, or the one you can find on the other channels, is merely just like a chewing of somebody else, a superficial sort of rework of some other sort of biased product chosen with debatable criteria and without adequate historical competence and awareness. We must recover this, right? So the Milanese business organization, there were no limits on the number of workers an entrepreneur could hire. This must be understood also in the light of what the Milanese seigneurial government allowed to happen, because it was entirely regulated by this de facto monarchic regime. So you can look at it and appreciate how far-sighted this rule actually was. It was common to engage day laborers to meet sudden spikes in demand as well. Subcontracting was also widespread, allowing an order to be divided among multiple businesses. For example, the armorer Giovanni de Vitis, during the mid-15th century, contracted with fellow artisan Giancomino da Trocazzano to produce helmets for his workshop. This organization, through specialization and subcontracting, was crucial to Milan's industrial capacity to swiftly address large orders. And think of how much they would profit. Right? There is a similar organization, for example, in the Genoese mercenary service, right? Differently from other countries that try to control its people and ultimately fail, because this began to sell their services abroad. This was also the case of the Swiss. I mean, initially they tried to keep an order on that, and you could find these people roaming around. The Genoese instead did, every time you see the Genoese crossbowmen or other also Marines, galleys, like, oh, you named them, somewhere else in Europe, those are actually Genoese forces. I mean, they're literally sent by the Most Serene Republic of Genoa. Yes, it was called Most Serene, just like Venice. And so that there is a very strong control. And this is why these were actual states, right? And that's the degree of actual political and territorial control these regimes enjoy. And so, as for Milan, workers in larger enterprises operated similarly to a modern assembly line. Depending on their specialization, they either continuously produce the same armor component or focus in its decoration. Unfortunately, we do not have, at least that I'm aware of up to this point, this overwhelming documentation about Milan, because it was a slightly, again, more authoritarian power. It's not so well documented like, I don't know, Florence. There was much more, again, Republican, for also like wealth being in comparison to Milan, at least, because otherwise wealth was very more evenly distributed in general than in any other country. That's also the reason why we have much more information about Italy, about these things. But we do not know exactly the entire process behind the industry, because these were all private corporations that, you know, worked in some kind of association, of course, with the government occasionally, and so we don't have the actual records from all the system, and so that would be fantastic, but unfortunately for medieval times we do not have that. We understand from different figures that the number of armorers in Milan remained relatively stable from the records noted by Bonvesin de la Riva in 1288 to the known statistics from 1474. By the end of the 15th century, in fact, 72 master armorers were practicing their craft near the Duomo, in addition to an unspecified number of craftsmen who did not hold the title of master. Right? This is the Milan of Francesco Sforza, who had taken power in 1450 and led his dynasty as rulers of Milan for the next 50 years. So, in spite of the mid-14th century crisis of general issues, Milan was not affected by plague. That may have been a factor in also boosting her interland, right? Where these miraculous, islands where plague apparently did not spread, like Poland, for example. It was also enjoying a great deal of exports in this time, because part of its demographics, by being spared by the Black Death, was now labor force, and began to export timber, grain, like from the vast Polish plains and forests. And Milan had maintained here apparently more or less the same, slightly less, like of course they had tended to compact themselves, but the armories, like the relative guilds, seem to have remained more or less in the same scale. consider what we were saying before, that there is an internationalization of warfare. There is an internationalization of the elites. At this point, warfare becomes ever more professional, ever more logistically served. So there is always in Milan space for such production, right? It makes me feel bad that we don't talk about Brescia. We shall cover surely in some regional historical series. It was yet another great center of arms and armor production close to Milan that, however, was conquered by the Venetians in Lombardy, and so the Venetians came pretty darn close to Milan herself, and so they of course had quite excellent arms and armor production for that matter. The Venetian condotta, together with the ordinances of Charles the Bold, are the finest armies of this generation. And I made a video about both, more videos actually about both armies. You have checked out if you're interested. So you imagine all the people working at this as well. Like, each workshop employed numerous apprentices, workers, assistants, although there is little information again on the typical workforce size in these enterprises. I made last summer, if I'm not wrong, a video about the Italian guilds, arts and crafts association. So if you're interested, it's more or less the same period. You can check that out. We know, however, interesting details, such as that King Louis XI of France, I made a video about him too, during the latter half of the 15th century, hired the Milanese armorer Giacobino Airoldo, along with 12 assistants, to create armor for him in France. Right? So, of course, the Italians were quite praised for those skills. Here we are heading towards the Renaissance. That Italy booms in this period. That basically every, scientific, technical field is monopolized. Literary one, artistic one, etc., is monopolized by the Italians. Italian becomes the language of modern Europe. It's the third classical language. You find these. Think about Leonardo and its connection with Francis, the first of France. We don't even have to go that far to explain, of course, how many skilled professionals came at this point from the peninsula at the courts of practically all of Europe. The interesting aspect is also that Louis XI is truly after his father Charles VII, that finished the 100 Years' War, the one that truly puts together France as a power. And so he seeks, Louis was very close also to the mercantile world in general. He wanted to trigger the French higher nobility that was still plotting against him by dressing up like a merchant, right? So he would unavoidably be very connected to the Italians that had branches pretty much all over the main center, Paris and Flanders and so on. So this is anecdotally not even just such a too meaningful example. A reasonable estimate suggests that the workforce involved in the armory industry constituted at least 1% of the total population of Milan. It would be interesting to make comparisons. For example, I made one in that video between the Athenian navy of the Athenian thalassocracy, the Periclean era, and today's, was a couple of years ago, but more or less U.S. Navy, based on spending, like making a comparison on more or less the cost, like the equivalent of, of the Navy cost, at least respective currencies updated historically. You could compare one another, and they were strikingly identical. I'm not even aware of any specific study. I made it myself in a very empirical ways, and I found it very, very interesting. In any case, you know that Italy is engulfed by the the wars coming from essentially the French invasion and then the Spanish, also the German one and so on. So the Italian wars bring especially Milan to lose her independence. Like, this was the most noticeable. After all, Venice maintained its independence, Savoy did, many other signories in the north. Florence maintained its independence, the Papal States maintained their independence. Milan was the most important Italian state in its that it loses its independence. It passes first to France, then to Spain, that will remain under up to, in fact, the War of Spanish Succession, after which it goes under the Habsburgs until the wars of Italian unification, but always, in fact, as the most advanced region, especially in these domains. Like, for example, in the Habsburgic Empire, Lombardy was by far the most advanced region, like even more than Austria itself, which also shows you how you can have pretty interesting deals. Like, you don't have to be the most advanced power to subjugate another, but you don't even have to particularly oppress the local populace to actually maintain control in a certain area. This is especially the case for Italy, that was always very much, in fact, rich and endemically really populated, to be actually as directly controlled. You have your vice realms, you have establishments basically, are complacent to the situation. It would be really interesting to make videos about early modern Italian history, because it's so underrated even in these aspects. In any case, aside from this, you can argue that Milan had become too significant to remain unnoticed by the emerging powers of Europe, right? And that's how, in the 1500s, it loses its independence, which of course diminishes the Milanese importance on the European stage. Right, before it was an independent state, at least, and now it's not free anymore, leading to a decline in its economic status. This downturn also impacted the armor industry. However, it signaled the start of a decrease in the military significance of armor itself, as the rise of firearms introduced projectiles that no armor could withstand, or at least at such a cost that it became obsolete, like not just in economical but, say, physical terms, in order to be wearing that protection in combat. And actually, like, again, the Lombard economy remains pretty updated throughout the centuries. Only those workshops, speaking of arms and armor, specializing in ceremonial parade armor, managed to endure for an extended period. In that case, Milan does maintain the palm of the most advanced, arms and armor, say armor production, if anything, at this point, because by arms we would also include firearms, to compete with the most acclaimed artists in chiseled work, embossing, and sculpture, due to the exceptional beauty of their creations. It would be interesting to finally talk more about the condottieri era, because you would see how, for example, the Ferrarese had excellent artillery, the Gonzaga had excellent mounts, right? But overall, they weren't like a unified state, and so Italy loses great part of its independence that the Italian states had somehow, from the mid-15th century, somehow began to realize being an important deal, but that wouldn't surpass the traditionally sort of individualistic mentality that these states had, because they legitimately could remain largely independent, regardless of the overall loss in say, opportunities as powers by themselves. And so, with a short-sightedness at the end of the day, that prevented an incredibly had Italy been unified at that point, would have surpassed in power like maybe if not France, basically any other country. Not even the Ottomans, of course, but let's say it would have been barely stoppable as an actual force. It's not even the discovery of the Americas, etc. Again, for another couple of centuries, these are the most advanced areas in not just in Europe but in the world, and still they even are. But of course, it's a different story. It's a different scenario, and you have the Italian states, even when remaining independent, aligning themselves mostly with the Habsburgs, right? So the Spanish, the Austrians, sometimes with the French as well. However, after the Italian wars, there is, and this is very underestimated, also as far as the Milanese arms and armor and glassware production for luxury markets mostly, actually an incredible moment of peace, of prosperity. This is often overlooked, but so it was. It's just like the plague of the mid-17th century. It changes a bit the situation. Then there are the wars of Spanish succession, but it's essentially almost 2 centuries of a particularly quiet, prosper time. Also considering that Italy is the only country that does not have religious wars on its soil, right? They're all Catholic. There is no confessional warfare. There are just, I talk about the Valdensians in the northwestern Alps, but it's more like a fringe issue, mostly involving France than the Italian part of the watershed. But it's an underrated time in history in which you can see the preservation of a great deal of wealth and stability that normally the sense, okay, well, let's stop studying Italy after the Italian wars because after all that's the boring part with no military study. Well, in part it's also because still this area did not need to become a battlefield for a long time still. And in any case, what could we discuss in this sense? In part, the types of arms and armor, like until the 13th century, a complete suit of armor consisted primarily of 2-layer system. The inner layer was known, at least in Italian, as farsetto d'arme, and it was constructed from leather or padded fabric, while a chainmail shirt was worn over it. And in the latter half of the 13th century, hammered metal plates, as we were saying before, began to be introduced to provide added protection for the limbs. Not only. The enhanced defensive capabilities of plate armor soon became the dominant form of protection on the battlefield, leading to the development of fully plate armors by the latter part of the 14th century. And that's also the moment of glory of Milan, because when you talk about Milanese armor, you're mostly talking about the 15th century as a style. It's also like the Gothic one, that's really the moment in which also full plate armor is affirmed. And so in this case, the Milanese armor artisans reach the extraordinary level of craftsmanship for which they're better known. Before, you could say that, yes, Lombardy was the most important arms and armor center of production in Europe, but say you couldn't quite simply distinguish, Tuscan from Milanese, Tuscan from Lombard armor, say. And we talked about this because there are some differences. Remember the Tuscan Angevin style with quietude. There's an idea that the Milanese have more access to metal works, they work it better and so on. There are so many factors. It would be, in fact, very interesting to compute when you look at this such wide and complex, articulated region like the Italian peninsula. There are so many influences and so many local autonomous developments and peaks, right? But say for the 14th century, you can see maybe a bit more of Transalpine influence in the north, some heavier stuff. Tendentially, it had been the case, but especially by the 13th to the 14th century, you can't say, the Papal States or Tuscany are essentially different. They're basically the same thing, or there are even more advanced features you find occasionally. And by that point, you don't have even a great deal of documentation about the single pieces of arms and armor. The famous pavis, for example, that does spread to the rest of Europe, mostly from Italy, even though the Lithuanians still already had it by the early 13th century, but it was being developed for different reasons in different regions. It's not that well documented until the later Middle Ages, and people say, the pavis, I know what it is. No, you don't, right? In the 13th century, say mid-13th century Florence, you do not exactly know what a pavis is and how it's classified. We see some Angevin, Neapolitan Marines, for example, that are, I think it's the only document we have found so far that describes a pavis of that era, and we realize it's actually a pretty small shield that would have had some other functions. Some pavises were smaller ones, were used on horseback as well in the early 14th century. In any case, we have to rely more on iconography in these previous times rather than archive sources that, in my opinion, are very, very overrated. Also even for the 15th century, when you have to actually appreciate the art of war and its developments, right? But this is, again, the point. The 15th century is the moment in which you can truly see that there is a Milanese mark, even though also the other parts of Italy produce pretty good armor. The Milanese armor artisans create this really elegant suit of armors that are not just elegant but comfortable and practicable and really the finest, again, available. The steel used in these armors, as we were saying, was polished to such a degree that the Milanese and Italian suits became known as white armor as a consequence. You could really mirror yourself into them. Regarding this historiographical issue that I routinely come up with, especially every time I talk about Italian history, because it is really, I promise you, like in the next decades, unless there is a collapse in the general, let's say, historical research for sound reason, we will witness the comeback of, in a sort of sensationalistic sense, especially if it's gonna be done by the Anglo-Saxons, but I'm not entirely sure that this is going to be the case. It's more likely for the Italians to recover this at that point. Like when you're looking for, even just for centuries, like this presence, like Milanese armors succeeding one another in their workshops, passing down their craft from generation to generation, that their names, not just for documentary reasons, have largely faded into obscurity. Right? Italian historical studies themselves have not adequately honored this tradition. And it's paradoxical, in fact, that it's rather European scholars to have been more diligent in documenting the numerous records detailing purchases from Milanese armors and the exquisite armors that adorn armories. Which is, however, not the best, meaning that, again, if we just study arms and armor, we are not really studying the art of war, right? It's just a basic materialistic deterministic interest that, believe me, and I studied this and made lots of videos on this topic, does not actually tell you much about medieval warfare. The average, even if you want simple-minded person, believes that if you know how a man-at-arm is armored, you understand how warfare in the time really was. Well, you're basically butchering the entire process of. First of all, we do not even have a comprehensive picture of how all these people were actually armored in an army, etc. But aside from moral forces per se, just how do you think warfare works? Just how you're armored. You should be able to reconstruct units, tactics, strategy, and this is something you cannot achieve if you don't study documentary sources, also the narrative ones that, especially in this area, also usually very, especially for the the early 14th century, very, very, the most advanced historiography existing at the time, very reliable, very accurate. You you cannot understand anything about that, aside from the fact that more or less Europeans had the same kind of armor with one another. So you could have this increases in quality in the case of Milan, etc. That is the top. But overall, there's not such a radical divide in the way all these peoples make war. In the contrary, if anything, also because, if you were to make it just a matter of panoply, again, Milanese armor is found everywhere. There are some areas that, and by the way, it's so expensive for places like, I don't know, Hungary or Romania, but all along the Danube, there was Italian armor being sold, together also with the German one at that point. We know of some figures of Romanian knights that say had all like the upper part of plate armor for the torso, but they wouldn't have enough money, wouldn't, maybe because their warfare was slightly lighter than, say, the one in Western Europe. They didn't have the full plate armor for the legs. You have this level of spread too. This is not just an Italian history. This is truly a European history. This is a European-wide and concretely European history. For that level of capillary spread of the armor itself, through the equally capillary spread of Italian banking and branches and markets and trade and so on. So you can't distinguish it from both. Like, just think how important all this is in comparison to the actual archaeology of the piece of armor. That may be beautiful to watch or whatever, but literally stops there, right? And no, like fighting in replicas, etc., has nothing to do 21st century mock combats with a 15th century men-at-arms craft, right? We have, if anything, like also from later times, important names attached as firms, basically, to this Milanese fashion rather than other just military products. Two families in particular. The Negroni family from Elam, known as Missaglia, whose activities began in the early 15th century, and the Negroli family, almost the same name, but they're different, originally named Barini, whose ancestor Giovanni completed his apprenticeship in the Missaglia workshop around the mid-15th century. You understand how intertwined they are. It's also interesting how they changed surname, by the way, because there were some sort of clans still at this point, and they had different branches themselves and so on. Again, it's a complicated story. You can't make it sound point. And these workshops produced both richly decorated ceremonial armor and practical pieces, thereby enriching their artisans, despite some noble clients' unreliable finances. And the Missaglia family in particular earned acclaim for the artistic quality of their creations, while the Negroli family, although not neglecting luxury items, played a key role in promoting the mass production of battle armor. Eventually, like with the introduction of firearms, you witness a decline of course, this especially mass production, because most soldiers did not wear armor, or at least did not wear the type of armor, the level of armoredness that had been necessary in the 15th century, again the peak of that. So that's why the same Milanese production shifts towards an elite product for the great houses of Europe that were ruling at the time, including the same Habsburgic rulers that were at that point like controlling the city. And so it's a bit like, again, the Bank of St. George in Genoa. After the Fugger failed, that's yet another interesting southern German connection. There was a lot of connection, especially between Bavaria and Venice, right? Think about the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, the very strong bond there, and so imagine all the beautiful paintings I used here by Tiziano, for example, about Charles V. This is old Milanese armor. The Milanese remained the armorers of the House of Habsburg, so for Spain, for Austria, and so and there are periods floating, like for example, Gothic armor is mostly famous for the 15th century. And yes, there are some definite type of German, but also you have them like French, Spanish, etc. types of armor that are also in fact more neatly distinguishable, because we can also track where they were made, especially considering they were much more expensive and elite. But in this sense also, in fact, more detached from the actual battlefield employment. This is, well, as you know, armor was important. There were cuirassiers, and still up to this day, to some, but I mean, of course, in direct involvement on the battlefield. So armor was always that important, and even, as you know, thickening, becoming more robust, trying to counter that firearm disproportionate amount of jowls that would arrive to literally pierce, like the earlier modes. And it was all gradual, telling the truth, but when especially you have not much of a technological improvement, but just what we pointed out with the Swiss creating square pikes of pikemen, most of which were unarmored. This was debatedly true also in the other eras, of course. The rare ranks of the battle lines were, generally speaking, made of naked or unarmored soldiers, but the squares were so deep, and especially they were so big in terms of quantity of men, that it didn't make any sense to try to armor them. So in the first ranks you would of course do that, because still lots of the firearm projectiles that would arrive at you would actually bounce over the armor. But at close range and in the mass of fire, of course, these were starting to pierce through armor, and gradually that armor would even become obsolete, because at that point you would be more conveniently invest into arquebusiers. That's why the Swiss model died, in a sense. Like, it wasn't a combined arms one, it was just pikemen. And then you have, in fact, pike and shot warfare that dominates European battlefields for another couple of hundred years, not even. After which, yes, you have cuirassiers, you have generals still wearing armor, but let's say armor is over to the extent it had been in ancient medieval times. And that's, in fact, a different world, a different order, different mentality as well, that we often cover, right? But in this sense, Italian armor is one of those chapters that you may really want to take into consideration, because for essentially, say, from the 12th century to the 17th, it's basically like half of a millennium, right? This was the best armor likely in the world. I mean, there were other great, of course, military tradition, China, India, you named them, but the level of, again, of European care for also that individual ethos, and still rigidly framed within a very strong discipline of all these various policies compressed in Europe, including Milan, or all these others, again, giving each other a tough time, but also sharing that westernness far beyond their political fragmentation, really are, in my opinion, the most advanced civilization in the world already at this point. I made lots of videos explaining this also for the previous centuries in the Middle Ages, and I think that even passing through all these various topics can illustrate really the how and why that is true. Right? It's not just looking at, look at what a beautiful armor. It's much more than that. It's based on the reason behind that, the care, the love. There's true love. When you look at this art, you realize that there is a general pursuit for, say, not necessarily of perfection per se, but still something that is beyond mere functionality. Beauty itself is a value. It's all baked into it, right? And so you can never distinguish that. And I can think of a more beautiful armor, of another peak of armor. If you think about it, other cultures did not really have full plate armor, right? Overall, like if you look at Eastern armor, it's always some sort of mix between plate and mail, right? Or you have lamellar as well up to a certain point, but the sense is just Europeans have something like foot plate armor, and that also are paradoxically the first ones to abandon it, because together with armor in general, when they were colonizing the world, there were still peoples that fought up to the 20th century with medieval armor, right? So this is very, very interesting if you think about it in perspective as well. I hope that this video covers enough of this process. Like it's one of those topics that I make for the so-called specials of the channel, as I realize that they're very important ones that we never covered them. So I give some sort of broader introduction. Then, of course, there are lots of other videos we can make on the same topic, and you know how Schwerpunkt works, right? It is fundamentally based on a cycle that gives you sort of more routine kind of content, and then these focuses that, however, are also minority in number, and they tend to be complemented by the cyclical content, let's say, and that does tend to get also, it has its swings definitely, but it tends to go more in depth right at some point, right? So we will surely talk about this again. I can tell you that I have something incoming about the condottieri that we never discussed. Yes, I made a video about Francesco Gonzaga, if I'm not wrong. It was one of the earliest videos in Schwerpunkt, but I fear we never really, aside from again that videos about the Venetian army, talk about the Battle of Molinella, there are some things we did, but in general we never introduced the condottieri. If not in a broader frame of the decline of the Communal army, the passage to the condottieri. And it's actually a very complicated story, because there are all the various phases. Like initially you have the foreigners, then you have the Italians. There are two different eras, but you see, people all put everything under the same umbrella, and instead it's all the late medieval civilizational history unfolding in very sort of also counterintuitive ways. Just remember what I always say about the fact that European military culture refeudalized between the mid-14th and mid-15th century. That's, for example, to me, as a military historian specialized in that, not much in that because I'm mostly about the first half of the 14th century, but let's say that's the ABC to me. When I read those things, here, the rise of infantry, the unchallenged, like the gradual, the progression, the freedom, the individual. That's not the story you have to tell. Also because we know everything pretty well. I mean, if a person does not know that, and also does not know that, the Renaissance is rather the triumph of the Ancien regime in terms of individual freedom, that a victory of the infantry on cavalry in the 16th century has nothing to do with the victory of infantry on cavalry in the 14th. It means you've never really even historied. The sense is, I always confront myself with this problem and realize also why other channels get more views than mine. They make simpler history, and that's the trick. Is not challenging anyone, not requiring any major effort, just looking at the pictures. Maybe I can tell you this, that unless I want, maybe with AI or something in the future, say, pictures, the graphic effects will be easier, let's say, I will never engage in that kind of content. I will never really spend my time for that specific kind of effective entertainment. This is not meant to be entertaining. This is meant to be to make people think and to make them appreciate really what's behind topics that they have heard about all the time, but they haven't quite focused on otherwise in more in-depth ways. Right? So, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.